Yamato could hurl a 3,000-pound shell more than 25 miles. On April 7, 1945, that firepower barely mattered. The battleship was steaming toward Okinawa with almost no fighter cover, while American carrier aircraft were already coming for it. Could a ship built to dominate the sea survive an enemy it could not reach? By the time the first American strike groups were forming above their carriers, the answer was already taking shape. Yamato had been designed for a very different kind of war. Her 9 main guns, each more than 18 inches in caliber, were meant to decide battles at extreme range. Her armor was built to absorb punishment from other capital ships. Fully loaded, she displaced more than 71,000 tons. In the naval thinking that produced her, size, armor, and heavy guns were supposed to create a decisive advantage when battle fleets finally met. But in the spring of 1945, Japan was no longer waiting for that battle. Yamato embodied the doctrine of a decisive surface battle. Her main battery could throw armor-piercing shells weighing more than 3,000 pounds. Her armor belt was built to withstand punishment at a scale few warships could match. If the problem was a line of hostile battleships closing across open water, Yamato had been designed as an answer. The war had moved toward a different problem. Aircraft carriers could attack without presenting themselves for a traditional exchange of heavy shells. By 1945, the skies around the Ryukyu approaches were dominated by American carrier aircraft. While the officers assigned to Operation Tengo knew Yamato would not have sustained fighter protection, the ship had reached the peak of its engineering at almost the same moment the strategic environment had moved beyond the problem it was built to solve. The war had reached Okinawa. American forces landed there on April 1. For Japan, the island stood directly in front of the home islands, and its loss would bring the war even closer to the Japanese mainland. In the air, the response was already desperate. Operation Kikusui sent waves of kamikaze aircraft against the American invasion fleet. Men and aircraft were being consumed in attacks meant to slow or break the assault. The surviving major surface ships of the Imperial Japanese Navy, however, were still largely in the inland sea. That contrast created pressure inside Japan's military leadership. The Army and Air Forces were being thrown into the defense of Okinawa while the Navy's most famous capital ships remained at anchor. A question reportedly raised at the Imperial level asked, in essence, whether the Navy still had ships it could send. For a service already carrying the weight of years of defeat, implication was hard to ignore. The Navy had to act. That demand collided with a grim material reality. Fuel was critically scarce. American carrier aircraft dominated the approaches to Okinawa, and the surface force could not count on sustained fighter cover. Keeping the surviving ships in port preserved steel, fuel, and crews, but it also made the Navy appear absent from the battle occurring at the Empire's doorstep. For the leadership in Tokyo, that absence had become politically and culturally intolerable. The decision that followed was therefore not the product of a new tactical opportunity. It was an attempt to convert the fleet's remaining physical strength into visible participation. The ship selected for that purpose was also the ship most burdened by symbolism. Yamato was not simply another hull in the order of battle. She was the largest expression of Japan's pre-war naval ambitions, and sending her toward Okinawa made the sacrifice impossible to ignore. Not because its remaining surface fleet had suddenly regained control of the sea. Not because fuel, aircraft, or tactical conditions had improved. The pressure was political, institutional, and cultural. The fleet was expected to prove that it would also commit itself to the defense of the homeland's outer perimeter. The result was Operation Tengo. At its center stood Yamato. The plan was extraordinary even by the standards of the final months of the Pacific War. Yamato would sail toward Okinawa with the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. If the force somehow broke through the American screen, Yamato was to run herself aground near the island and become a fixed artillery position. Her main guns would support the defenders until her ammunition was gone or the ship was destroyed. Survivors were then expected to go ashore and continue the fight. This was not a sortie built around a path home. A later popular story claimed that Yamato was given only enough fuel for a one-way voyage. The account used here rejects that version. Fuel was desperately scarce, but local personnel filled her bunkers with more oil than the minimum required for the outbound trip. The mission was still one way for a simpler reason. The operational concept did not include a return. Yamato was expected to reach Okinawa Beach herself and be lost there. That difference matters. The doomed character of the mission did not come from an empty fuel tank. It came from the orders. The officers who would have to carry them out understood the problem immediately. The force itself made the weakness obvious. Yamato would have 1 light cruiser and 8 destroyers around her. Those escorts could screen, maneuver, rescue survivors, and add anti-aircraft fire, but they could not manufacture the missing ingredient: a sustained combat air patrol strong enough to keep American carrier aircraft away. Once the force moved beyond the protection of Japanese land bases, every mile south increased the time it would spend exposed to enemy search and attack. The mission also asked a mobile capital ship to survive long enough to become something it had never been designed to be, a grounded fortress. To reach that final phase, Yamato first had to cross hostile water, evade or survive reconnaissance, withstand carrier strikes, penetrate the American defensive screen around Okinawa, and still retain enough weapons and crew to fight from the beach. Every stage depended on the previous one succeeding. Failure at sea meant the shore battery plan would never matter. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, commanding the force, and other experienced officers objected. They had spent years watching air power transform naval combat. By 1945, a large surface ship without sustained fighter protection was not merely vulnerable. Against a fleet built around fast carriers, it could be attacked long before its own main battery had a target. The Japanese officers were not debating whether Yamato was powerful. They were debating whether her power could be brought into the kind of fight for which it had been created. That was the central contradiction. Yamato's armor was designed to survive shells from battleships. Her guns were designed to destroy battleships. But there was no guarantee an American battleship would ever come near her. The objections became heated. The officers argued that the sortie could waste thousands of trained sailors without changing the battle for Okinawa. They proposed other possible uses for the surviving ships, including preserving them for the defense of the home islands, or using them in ways that did not require a direct run into American carrier air power. The mission survived those objections because its purpose was larger than tactical efficiency. It was presented as sacrifice, participation, and support for the wider effort around Okinawa. The surface force could also draw American attention and aircraft away from other attacks. Faced with orders that had already taken shape at the highest levels, Ito accepted. The acceptance did not make the plan more practical. It only ended the argument. Men aboard the force prepared for a mission whose official logic pointed toward destruction. Sailors wrote final letters and made personal preparations before departure. That atmosphere matters because the crew did not sail under the illusion that a normal fleet operation was beginning. The possibility of survival existed for individuals, but the operation itself had been built around the loss of its centerpiece. On the afternoon of April 6, 1945, Yamato left Japan for the last time. There was no large protective umbrella of Japanese fighters waiting overhead. The battleship, Yahagi, and the destroyers moved south through waters that were already part of an American surveillance system. And this is where the operation began to fail before a single bomb struck the ship. Its first requirement was surprise. It did not have it. American radio intelligence had intercepted Japanese communications and learned of the sortie. The intended movement was therefore being watched before Yamato reached the open Pacific. Submarines were placed along likely routes. As the force emerged from the Bungo Strait, the submarines USS Threadfin and USS Hackleback sighted and reported the Japanese ships. That contact did more than confirm that Yamato had sailed. It turned a decoded intention into a tracked physical target. From that moment, the Americans did not have to search the Western Pacific blindly for a battleship trying to disappear. The Japanese force was moving through a corridor that could be watched from below the surface and then from the air. In another war, a battleship might have relied on darkness, weather, or the sheer size of the ocean to conceal its movement. Here, each layer of American reconnaissance reduced that possibility. A submarine sighting could be followed by aircraft. Aircraft could refresh the contact. A carrier commander receiving those reports could launch a strike toward a moving position rather than toward an empty patch of sea. Intelligence did not sink Yamato by itself, but it made the long-range attack possible on American terms. The task force had left port, but its movement was no longer secret. By the morning of April 7, American reconnaissance aircraft were also finding and shadowing it. Course, speed, and position could be relayed back to the fleet. Yamato was still hundreds of miles from the kind of surface engagement for which she had been built, yet the American command already possessed the information needed to attack her. This was not simply a contest of weapons. It was a contest of reach. The American fleet could find Yamato from beyond the horizon, launch aircraft from beyond the horizon, and keep the carriers that generated those attacks beyond the reach of Yamato's main battery. For a brief moment, another ending seemed possible. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, prepared surface forces to intercept. Task Force 54 included American battleships capable of forming a gun line. Had that engagement occurred, Yamato would at least have entered the kind of contest her designers understood: armor against armor, heavy shell against heavy shell, battleship against battleship. But Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding the fast carriers of Task Force 58, had a different weapon already in position: aircraft. Nearly 400 fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo aircraft were launched in the broad American response. They did not need Yamato to see the carriers. They only needed to find the ship. That distinction shifted risk away from the American capital ships. A surface interception would have required battleships and cruisers to approach a vessel carrying the largest naval guns then afloat. Even a tactically superior American force would have accepted the possibility of heavy shell damage in order to destroy her. Carrier aviation offered another geometry. The striking force could be put in danger without putting the flight decks that generated it inside Yamato's gun range. If the first wave failed to stop the target, another wave could follow. The aircraft also brought different tools to the same problem. Fighters could suppress exposed gun positions and protect the strike. Dive bombers could attack the upper works and anti-aircraft defenses. Torpedo aircraft could attack the hull below the waterline, where flooding rather than armor penetration would determine survival. The point was not that any single aircraft was stronger than Yamato. It was that hundreds of aircraft could attack different vulnerabilities, while the battleship had no direct way to strike back at their floating bases. The mismatch was now complete. Yamato had been built around the belief that the decisive naval weapon was the biggest gun carried by the strongest hull. The Americans were about to attack with a system that separated detection, strike, and risk across hundreds of miles of ocean. When the Japanese lookouts finally saw aircraft approaching, the task force opened fire. Yamato carried a huge anti-aircraft battery, more than 150 barrels in the supply to count, along with special anti-aircraft ammunition that could be fired from the main guns. The ship and her escorts filled the sky with bursts of flak. The volume was frightening. It was not enough. American pilots came in from different directions and altitudes. Dive bombers attacked from above. Torpedo aircraft dropped low over the water. Fighters suppressed exposed positions and added to the confusion around the formation. For the Japanese gunners, this created a problem no amount of courage could simplify. A weapon trained high against a diving aircraft could not instantly answer a torpedo plane approaching close to the water. Attacks from different directions forced the defense to divide its attention. Smoke, blast, spray, and the violent maneuvering of the escorts disrupted sight lines. Anti-aircraft fire might destroy individual planes, but the defense had to keep working across the entire formation, while the attackers needed only enough weapons to get through. Yamato's main battery even carried special anti-aircraft shells intended to burst into a spread of burning fragments. They were spectacular, but spectacle was not interception. The battleship's heavy guns were slow instruments against fast aircraft arriving from multiple bearings. Her enormous primary weapon system had been forced into a role far removed from the one for which it had been optimized. The first hits did not immediately kill Yamato. Bombs tore into the superstructure and secondary positions, damaging radar and exposed anti-aircraft crews. Torpedoes struck low against the hull. The explosions were separated by seconds, direction, and altitude, but their effects began to interact. Damage to the upper works reduced defensive fire. Fluting reduced maneuverability. Reduced maneuverability made later attack runs easier. Every successful strike made the next phase more dangerous. Bombs struck the upper works and damaged anti-aircraft positions. Torpedoes hit below the waterline. Men were thrown across steel decks. Compartments began to flood, and yet the battleship kept moving. For the sailors aboard her, this was the dangerous moment when engineering strength could look like invulnerability. The hull absorbed damage that would have destroyed a smaller ship. Yamato continued at roughly 22 knots during the early phase of the attack. Her guns kept firing. Her size and armor seemed to be doing what they had been designed to do. But survival was already becoming a problem of geometry. The crucial damage was not only how many torpedoes struck, it was where the flooding accumulated. American torpedo attacks increasingly concentrated on Yamato's port side. Repeated underwater explosions opened the same side of the ship to more and more seawater. Each new hit added weight where the previous hits had already made balance difficult. Damage control crews responded with one of the few tools available to them: counter-fluting. If seawater was pulling the ship down to port, compartments on the starboard side could be deliberately flooded to bring the hull back toward level. It was a brutal calculation. Every ton of water admitted to save the ship's balance was also another ton the ship had to carry. At first, the method worked well enough to keep Yamato in the fight, but it could not work forever. There were only so many spaces available for counter-fluting. Pumps could remove only so much water. Progressive damage could jam systems, cut power, distort the hull, and make access below decks more dangerous by the minute. The attack did not give the crew time to recover. Another wave came in, then another. The repeated wave structure mattered as much as the first hits. Damage control crews need time. Time to isolate a flooded space, restore power, move wounded men, shift ammunition, assess a steering problem, and bring pumps to bear. The American attack denied that time. Problems that might have been survivable in isolation accumulated faster than crews could fully solve them. A list corrected after one torpedo strike returned after the next. A damaged gun position left another sector thinner. A slowing ship gave the following pilots a more predictable target. While Yamato absorbed the main weight of the strikes, her escorts were also being broken apart. Yahagi was hit by a torpedo early in the attack and lost power. Once the cruiser was stopped, Later aircraft could attack a target that could no longer maneuver. Bomb and torpedo hits followed. The destroyers were forced into violent evasive movement, and the defensive formation became harder to maintain. The Japanese force had left port as a group. Under air attack, it was being reduced to isolated ships fighting for their own survival. That mattered because Yamato's protection had never been only armor. A warship also depends on the formation around it, the aircraft above it, the sensors that warn it, the escorts that divide an attacker's attention, and the ability to maneuver within that system. One by one, those layers were disappearing. The port list worsened. As the deck tilted, anti-aircraft guns lost useful firing arcs. Moving ammunition became harder. Crews had to work on a surface that was no longer level while smoke and damage cut through the ship's internal organization. More torpedoes hit. Water entered faster than it could be controlled. The engineers continued counterfluting on the starboard side, but the reserve of usable spaces was being consumed. In the supplied account, emergency flooding reached machinery spaces and lower compartments while men were still below. The effort could buy time, but it could not restore the ship that had existed before the attack. There is a point in damage control where a crew is no longer trying to make a warship fully operational. It is trying to delay the moment when physics wins. Yamato crossed that point. Her speed fell. A propeller shaft was lost. Steering became severely compromised, and the ship was left turning under increasing list. The remaining anti-aircraft crews were now defending a vessel that could no longer maneuver freely beneath the attack. The battleship had not been penetrated in the way her designers had feared most. No American battle line had closed the range and punched heavy shells through her belt in a classic duel. Instead, bombs were dismantling the exposed upper structure while torpedoes were turning the ocean itself into weight inside the hull. That was the mechanism Yamato could not answer. The ship had enormous firepower forward and aft. It had no equivalent way to reach the carriers that kept sending aircraft. It had enormous armor. Armor could not restore buoyancy once flooding spread faster than damage control could contain it. It had thousands of sailors. Human effort could not create new counterfluting volume after the available spaces had been used. The same scale that made Yamato terrifying in a surface engagement now made the loss of balance catastrophic. Tens of thousands of tons of steel, machinery, armor, ammunition, fuel, and incoming seawater were being pulled by gravity toward one side. Fresh aircraft appeared again. By now the American pilots were attacking a slower target with a steepening list and a weakened anti-aircraft defense. Additional torpedo hits drove more water into the damaged side. The angle increased past the point at which the ship could recover. Below decks, passageways that had been horizontal became steep climbs or drops. Hatches became difficult to reach, compartments filled in darkness. Men in the lower levels faced a maze that was physically changing orientation around them. On the bridge, the end was no longer an abstract possibility. Vice Admiral Ito had opposed the mission before sailing. Now there was no tactical choice left that could reverse it. The supplied account describes him taking leave of surviving officers and remaining aboard. Captain Kosaku Ariga gave the order to abandon ship. For many sailors, that order came too late to be useful. As the list increased, moving across the deck became difficult. Launching boats from a capsizing battleship was nearly impossible. Men who reached the exterior had to fight gravity, loose equipment, smoke, and the pull of the sea. By about 2:20 in the afternoon, Yamato was rolling beyond recovery. 3 enormous main turrets, each weighing thousands of tons, were seated in their barbette by their own weight, rather than held in place like ordinary machinery. As the hull rolled, the geometry that had kept them seated disappeared. The battleship went over. At approximately 2:23, a tremendous explosion tore through the capsizing ship. The exact internal sequence of that final detonation cannot be established confidently from the supplied account alone, but the result was unmistakable. A towering column of fire, smoke, and debris rose above the sea as Yamato disappeared. For the aircraft still nearby, the scale of the blast marked the end of the attack more clearly than any radio report could. Moments earlier, the largest battleship ever constructed had still been a physical presence on the surface, burning, listing, but enormous. After the explosion, the structure that had dominated every visual comparison was gone beneath the water. What remained was wreckage, oil, survivors, and the broken escort force. The ship that had been created to survive the heaviest gunfire of its age was gone without ever reaching Okinawa. Of the 3,332 men aboard in the supplied account, fewer than 300 survived. Yahagi was also lost. Several destroyers were sunk or badly damaged. Operation Tengo had failed before the Japanese force came close to carrying out the beaching plan. Yamato never became a shore battery. She never fired her 18-inch guns at an American warship during the operation, and the carriers that generated the attack never had to enter the range of those guns. That last fact is the one that gives the sinking its real meaning. It is easy to tell the story as a simple victory of aircraft over a battleship, but that description is too small. Aircraft were only the visible final weapon. Before the first strike arrived, American intelligence had already reduced Japanese surprise. Submarines and reconnaissance aircraft helped maintain contact. Carrier groups provided the range to turn that information into force. Large numbers of trained air crews could be launched, organized, and sent across open ocean. The attack could be repeated in waves. The carriers themselves remained far enough away that Yamato's greatest weapons had nothing to shoot at. The decisive advantage was not one bomb, one torpedo, or one heroic pilot. It was the system connecting information, distance, aircraft, and repeated attack. That system also exposed the deepest weakness in Operation Tengo. The Japanese plan required a chain of unlikely successes. Yamato had to preserve surprise, avoid decisive air attack, reach Okinawa, break through the American naval screen, beach herself in a useful position, and still have enough combat power left to function as artillery. The American response did not need to defeat every stage separately. It only had to break the chain early. Once Yamato was found and carrier aircraft could reach her in strength, the mission's later phases became theoretical. This is why the story is larger than the familiar argument over whether battleships had become obsolete. Yamato's guns were not fake power, and her armor was not meaningless engineering. Both were formidable within the conditions they had been designed to exploit. What failed was the assumption that those conditions could still be imposed on the enemy. The Americans controlled whether the engagement would happen at gun range or beyond the horizon. Yamato could not force them to choose the former. Operation Tengo placed Yamato inside that system, while denying her the one condition that might have made her most dangerous, a surface enemy willing to close the range. The Japanese officers who objected to the mission had recognized this before sailing. Their concern was not cowardice, and it was not a lack of faith in the ship. It was an understanding that a weapon can be immensely powerful and still be almost useless when the battlefield no longer matches the assumptions built into it. Yamato represented the peak of one answer to naval war. Build the largest hull, protect it with the thickest practical armor, give it guns capable of smashing any rival that comes close enough. The American carrier force represented another answer. Find the enemy first, strike from outside the enemy's reach, repeat the attack until the target can no longer move, fight, or remain afloat. On April 7, 1945, those two answers did not meet as equals. One could act across the horizon, the other could not. Yamato's final mission had begun as an attempt to turn a battleship into a symbol of national sacrifice. Yet the manner of her destruction revealed something more concrete than symbolism. It showed how little raw size and armor could accomplish once control of information, airspace, and engagement distance had shifted to the other side. The ship's great guns remained mechanically powerful to the end. That was never the problem. The problem was that power is only useful when it can be applied. Yamato did not lose the gun battle she had been built to fight. On her final day, that battle never existed.